I'm Elizabeth at A Literary Princess, and today I am doing the first video of the George Eliot project. So, when I announced this project, I said that I was going to be doing vlogs for each book. I attempted, and I discovered I am not good at vlogging. So I'm just going to be doing a regular sit-down video for each book when I'm done reading it. If you missed my announcement for the George Eliot project, I am spending the year reading every piece of George Eliot's fiction in publication order, reading one a month with the exception of Middlemarch, which I have allotted 2 months. So, George Eliot's first published fiction was Scenes of Clerical Life in 1857, and this is 3 connected short stories that are all set in the same area. So, let's jump into what I thought. The 3 stories are The Sad Fortunes of the Reverend Amos Barton, Mr. Gilfil's Love Story, and Janet's Repentance. I think I will start by kind of giving a brief summary of each of the stories and what I thought of them, and then I'm going to go into some of the themes and concepts that George Eliot is bringing in here. The Sad Fortunes of the Reverend Amos Barton is the first story, and this is focused, as you might expect, on Reverend Amos Barton. He is the curate in Shepperton, I believe it is, and people don't really like him. He is very high-minded when it comes to church things, whereas the people in the area are just very practical-minded. And this causes them to not really connect with him very well. He is also very poor, but is living with his wife, and there are, I believe, 6 children, and she's pregnant with another one. Which, wow. We have like the gossip of the town and what all that they're all saying about him, and then we have the Reverend and his family. And he and his family are acquainted with Countess Zerlaski, whose name I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, who lives in the area with her brother. And the people of Shepperton are extremely suspect of her. They think she is bad news, sketchy. And when the Countess's brother marries her maid, she leaves the house in a huff and asks to come and stay with the Reverend and his family. And this goes on for months, and it starts some rumors going about what she is actually doing there. So this is the shortest of all of the stories in this book, and honestly, it was my least favorite. I would say it's probably about a 3-star. It's well written, but I felt like there wasn't quite as much there as there are in the other 2 stories. George Eliot was very much reminding me of Anthony Trollope at the beginning of this story. Lots of focus on, of course, church politics, which all 3 of these involve, but also just all the different characters and kind of hearing the different gossip of the town and who thinks what about these other characters. It was very reminiscent of Anthony Trollope, and it was quite funny as well. Like, there was a certain quiet satire. And then the end of the story came. And it just got really sad out of nowhere. And I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh, okay. And it didn't really feel satisfying at all. Like, I don't mind an unhappy ending, that's fine. And I will say that all 3 of these are downers at the end. But it didn't feel like there was a good conclusion. Like, it did end up with the townspeople liking Amos Barton more, but I don't know, it didn't feel worth it to me, I guess. The second story is Mr. Gilfil's Love Story, and this was my favorite of the 3. This is focused on Mr. Gilfil, who is another clergyman, before Amos Barton was a clergyman. So when the Reverend Amos Barton has started, Mr. Gilfil has already passed away, but here we go back to when Mr. Gilfil is alive, and then we go back even further to when Mr. Gilfil was a young man, and he is the clergyman for Cheverel Manor, which is the home of the Baronet Sir Christopher and his wife Lady Cheverel, and they were actually the guardians of Mr. Gilfil, whose name is Maynard Gilfil. That's a name. But anyway, so in addition to having him as their ward, they also have this young Italian girl named Caterina, who's called Tina. And she is the real focus of this story. And as you might expect, she is the object of Mr. Gilfil's affections. In addition to having these two wards that they take care of, the Cheverels also have a nephew who is the heir to the estate, Captain Wybrow. And Tina is in love with Captain Wybrow, who has kind of encouraged her affections, even though he has no intentions of marrying her, because Sir Christopher wants him to marry well, and Tina is just an orphan Italian girl who happens to have a lovely singing voice. So when Captain Wybrow gets engaged to a wealthy young woman, Tina has a very difficult time and is very much pining. And then we have Mr. Gilfil looking on, being very worried about her because he is in love with her and would like to marry her, even though he knows that she does not love him. I just love this story. This had a bit of melodrama to it, which I appreciate because I like melodrama. And also it had to do with marriage and relationships. And that's just more interesting to me than kind of town gossip and religious disputes, I guess would be the best word for it. So Mr. Gilfil's love story was definitely my favorite. I would probably give it a 4.5 stars. Janet's Repentance is the one that focuses the most on the actual religious disputes. I found this is kind of the standard church versus the kind of rising evangelical movement. And in this we have Mr. Tieran, who is some kind of clergyman, and he's on the evangelical side, and he is trying to start this kind of Sunday evening lectures, but he's being deposed largely by Mr. Dempster, who is a lawyer in the town and who thinks he knows everything and really knows nothing, and he is an alcoholic, and he is also incredibly abusive to his wife Janet, who has then also turned to alcohol as a way to kind of numb the pain. And this really focuses on Janet's conversion. It's Janet's repentance. So this is focused a lot on her in the second half, but the first half we really have her husband being a pain in the ass, essentially, to Mr. Tieran, and just generally being a horrible person. And we see the abuse that he puts Janet through. And then we see Janet move from like supporting her husband's views, even though he's so awful to her, to realizing that Mr. Tieran is actually a really wonderful man and having his beliefs really help her. Again, this one ends rather sadly. They all end rather sadly. I would give this one probably 4 stars. I was not super enamored with it in the first half, but once we were really focusing on Janet, I liked it a lot more. So what are some of the themes and concepts George Eliot is exploring here? The first one is, of course, realism. George Eliot was very big on realism and trying to present life as it actually is. So, I mean, and there's even times in here where she's addressing the reader and saying, if you're looking for a story where, you know, the men are perfect and the women are all beautiful and everything like goes in a certain way, there's plenty of other books out there for you. This isn't the book for you. So there are points where she is very much kind of moving toward her manifesto of realism that she ultimately will give in chapter 17 of Adam Bede. This is something I always find really off-putting about George Eliot. Like, I don't mind realism. Realism is great. But she has a very condescending attitude about it that just kind of drives me nuts. Like, that those other books aren't good enough and this is like the right way to do things. I don't know. From what I have seen of her later work is less like that. So maybe, I mean, this was her first piece of fiction, so maybe that's why. And Adam Bede was her first novel, so that's in there as well. I do find that a little bit off-putting, but at this point I'm just kind of used to it with George Eliot, I suppose. So, and also, I mean, it's not as if, I mean, I suppose all of this technically could happen, yes, but I mean, Mr. Gilfil's love story is a bit melodramatic, and there's some melodrama in Janet's repentance as well. But I will say that she is dealing with very real problems here, especially in Janet's repentance, dealing with alcoholism and abuse very blatantly too. She's not mincing words about it, and while she does tend to like imply the violence more than actually show it, like we'll get up to the point where he's about to be violent and then we kind of pan away, but it's very clear what's going on, which was not super common for the Victorian era. So I found that very interesting and I really appreciated it. This book also deals a lot with illness. All three stories have at least one character that suffers from some kind of illness, and there are at least one sick room scene in each of them. There's a character with heart palpitations in Mr. Gilfil's love story that is, like, we're always very aware of that with him. So I think that's really interesting to look at from that perspective. I have a friend who works with illness and disability in 19th century novels, so I'm going to be recommending this to her if she hasn't read it already. But it is something that I now notice. And of course, we have a lot about the goings-on of the church and the various controversies there, as well as the different roles and kind of the tensions regarding them. Like, we have the curate who doesn't get paid a lot but does a lot of work, as opposed to the vicar who barely ever shows up. So that's very interesting to see. I will say that's probably the hardest part for me to understand, because this is not how my church functions. Like, I'm like, even though I do Victorian literature and I see these words all the time, I'm still not entirely sure, like, the difference between some of them. And then we have the rising tensions between kind of like the standard Church of England and like the kind of rising evangelical movement. And then of course there's always the dissenters over there, and they're awful, but like the evangelicals are almost dissenters. They're like one step up from dissenters. So that's also very interesting. And if you're interested in that, this is a great book to take a look at. So what did I think of it overall? I liked it. I gave it 4 stars as a whole. I wasn't a huge fan of Amos Barton, but the other 2 stories more than made up for that. So I will say it's completely worth the read, especially if you're interested in George Eliot and seeing her develop, or just in Victorian realism, because she is one of the major names in that. I will say, if you start it and you're like, wow, the Sad Fortunes of Reverend Amos Barton is really slow, bear with it, it does get better. The first read of the George Eliot project was a success. Next month, we will be moving on to Adam Bede, the first of George Eliot's novels. Let me know down in the comments below, have you read Scenes of Clerical Life? What did you think? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.